Time for Money Power Politics. We have known President Trump has had an extensive relationship with my former employer, Deutsche Bank. But a new detailed, extraordinary report from the New York Times lays out just how deep the decades-old relationship goes. After speaking with more than 20 current and former DB executives and board members, those interviews revealed that, quote, over nearly 2 decades, Deutsche Bank's leaders repeatedly saw red flags surrounding Mr. Trump. There was a disastrous bond sale, a promised loan that relied on a banker's forged signature, wild exaggerations of Mr. Trump's wealth, even a claim of an act of God. All of this comes as Deutsche Bank is expected to start handing over communications about President Trump to congressional committees on the Hill. David Enrich, is that how I pronounce it?
You got it.
Enrich is the finance editor for the New York Times. He wrote this extensive piece, and I will tell you, as a Deutsche Bank alumni, you nailed it. I know you reached out to the White House for comment. They referred you to the Trump Organization. Amanda Miller from the Trump Organization designed to comment. Help me understand what Deutsche Bank has told you, because it's really important for people to understand the culture of Deutsche Bank. When it moved to the United States, it was a dog track. They took massive risk. They were desperately trying to build their name and build their brand in the Americas, and they took way more risk than their peers did.
Yeah, it was by design. They gave employees and executives a very clear mandate, which was to push the envelope as far as they could, make as much money as quickly as they could, and do whatever it takes to make a buck. And it was a very clear incentive structure. And so you saw bankers doing exactly what you'd expect. And in some cases, you saw them lending to people or institutions that no one else would touch. Donald Trump's a classic example of that. And they, time after time after time, threw more money at him, one time after another, even when he defaulted on his loans, even when he sued the bank, even when there are all these red flags about him inflating his assets, even when other executives inside the bank said, we cannot do business with this guy. He lies, he defaults, he has ties to organized crime. One time after another, they kept throwing money at him.
And why is that? So let's go to the institutional side of the bank that had done that failed bond sale. Donald Trump came to them, and it was after The Apprentice, and he grossly inflated his worth. And when they said, sir, we've looked at your assets, you're not worth this, he said, look at my brand, the brand of The Apprentice. It's worth billions and billions of dollars. And the institutional side of the house said, go fish. Why would the private bank, his private banker who was sitting there front row at the inauguration, open the door?
Well, same story. They were eager to grow. They saw the private banking business in the U.S., which is what caters to really, really rich people. They saw a need, and they saw an ability to make money off of these people. And so they were going to grow. And the way to do that, they saw, was to bank clients in more aggressive, more complicated, bigger ways than their competitors were. And that meant they would do big business with clients that other institutions would not touch. Donald Trump is a great example.
Was it about his brand name? Because he wasn't super rich, and he was a terrible risk assessment, given that he failed to pay back his loans. He sued the bank, but he was a big, flashy name. And a bank like Deutsche Bank doesn't have names like that. And we know that there's that Deutsche Bank Pro-Am in August. You detail it in your piece. And they love having Donald Trump show up.
They loved it. And they loved doing promotional videos with him and with Ivanka Trump. They really milked this relationship for all it's worth. I will say he defaulted over and over again on the institutional side, so the Wall Street side. When Rosemary Vrablich's team comes in on the private banking side, as far as we know, those loans have not defaulted. We don't know for sure because Trump is in the White House and we have no disclosures about this, but they probably did make money off of that. Now, the problem is, while they're actually earning money on managing his assets and interest rates on the loans, it's a huge self-inflicted tarnishing of their reputation. Deutsche Bank has become synonymous, I think, in the United States right now with money laundering for Russians and lending to Donald Trump.
So after President Trump won, how did Deutsche Bank handle all this?
Panic. And the first thing they did was assess a number of reports actually, into how on earth they got into this mess. Because it turned out people at the board level and even some of the very senior executives hadn't even realized until pretty recently that Trump was a major client. They were just completely clueless, completely in the dark, which is kind of scary.
Even though they were making promotional videos with him, even though he was there swinging a golf club at the Deutsche Bank Pro-Am?
There's a certain amount of willful ignorance, I think, here. It's also a testament to the fact that the bank's top executives kept changing because the bank was in such a financial financial mess that by that time they were on their third or fourth CEO in probably 5 years. So there was a lot of confusion. But also, look, they were so eager to be doing this business that they had just looked the other way. It was very much you put your blinders on and you don't see what you don't want to see, and you keep doing things that make money.
Well, portions of the bank were. Sort of that Rich Burns side of the house said no thanks, and Rosemary said, come on in. Part of the cloud that we've heard since President Trump won has been ties to Russia. Do you find any direct links? Because something that stands out about Deutsche Bank as opposed to other global banks, after the crisis in Russia in the 90s, the only bank that stayed in Russia was Deutsche Bank. The chairman, Joseph Ackerman, had ties to the Bank of Cyprus, where Paul Manafort laundered money, where Wilbur Ross, I believe, was a board member of.
Wilbur Ross was a part owner of it, along with Viktor Vekselberg, a Russian oligarch. There's a lot more to the Deutsche Bank Russia connections and the Russia Joe Ackerman connections than has been reported. And you might have to wait for my book on Deutsche Bank and Donald Trump early next year for that. But look, I have not found any evidence, any direct evidence that Deutsche Bank has been a vehicle for Russian money to Donald Trump. Now, and I've talked to a lot of people, and I think that if that was obvious to most executives, I would know about it because I've talked to so many of them. On the other hand, I very unfortunately do not have subpoena power, and Congress does. And they are about to use that subpoena power. The New York Attorney General does and is using that subpoena power on Deutsche Bank. And so it wouldn't surprise me at all if there's a lot more to be found here. But I have not found any evidence of Russian money going to Trump through Deutsche Bank.
So based on your reporting, is there anything here that would point to the relationship being illegal? Because at this point, you could say it's sleazy, it didn't make sense, they took too much risk, and all of those being the case would point to Deutsche Bank's stock and the performance they've had since the crisis, which has been disastrous, right? So they took way too much risk before the crisis, and they have failed ever since. But as far as criminal wrongdoing, is there anything that you have reported?
I'm not a lawyer, and I should be careful in what I say, but I know that what Congress and what the New York Attorney General are investigating is, among other things, evidence of bank fraud. And they're looking for evidence, among other things, that Donald Trump inflated his assets, lied about his wealth in order to get loans from Deutsche Bank. And under certain circumstances, that can be a crime. And that's certainly one of the things that prosecutors in New York, at least, are investigating.
And the question will be, why on earth would Deutsche Bank have signed off on it? You don't simply just trust what someone puts down on a piece of paper.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.